In just over 2 weeks, all eyes will be on Iowa. That's when the state's Republicans will caucus in the first nominating contest of 2024 for the President of the United States. Now, these make-or-break races for Republican presidential hopefuls, they will be happening against the backdrop of an urgent and unprecedented constitutional question. You are looking at the first seconds of Donald Trump's presidency. In this video, he is taking the oath of office, swearing to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that no person who takes this oath shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States government or have given aid to anyone who did. 1,447 days later, the same spot where Donald Trump swore that oath would be overrun by extremist supporters weaponizing flags that bore his name. Their goal? To violently prevent the peaceful transfer of power. It was the definition of an insurrection. In 13 months, the former president wants to stand on that spot and take that oath again. But does Section 3 prohibit Donald Trump from appearing on a primary ballot? Well, the United States Constitution gives insurrection or instruction on presidential elections, but it actually makes no mention of how to nominate candidates. So that process is up to the states, leaving officials across the country to wrestle with this very crucial and urgent question. Most recently in Maine, Secretary of State Shanna Bellows, as mandated by her state's laws, heard objections to Donald Trump's candidacy from registered voters, then heard counter-arguments from representatives for Donald Trump, before ultimately deciding that he was disqualified under Section 3. In Colorado, Republican and unaffiliated voters sued Democratic Secretary of State Jena Griswold in her official capacity, arguing that Donald Trump should not appear on the ballot. Secretary Griswold agreed, but the question went all the way to the Colorado Supreme Court, which also decided that Trump was ineligible to run in their state. Now, both of these rulings have been suspended to allow for appeals, but here's what both secretaries of state have said about their processes.
I made a decision because I was obligated to by the law and the oath that I took to the Constitution.
I do believe the Colorado Supreme Court got it right, that Trump should be disqualified from the ballot because of his role in the insurrection. But ultimately, I will follow whatever decision is in place.
But not every official has agreed with these secretaries of state, including one that might surprise you. California Secretary of State Shirley Weber declined to remove Donald Trump from the ballot despite pressure from her own lieutenant governor and some other California Democrats, although not Governor Newsom. Secretary Weber told the LA Times she found Trump's behavior abhorrent and anti-democratic, but added, quote, "If I believe in this democracy that is there, I have to basically continue to abide by the rule of law. And for me to not do that, then I am no better than Trump, and I must be better than Trump." The United States Supreme Court is facing extreme pressure to make a final ruling on Donald Trump's eligibility that can apply to the nation as a whole. But this is unprecedented constitutional territory, y'all. To reach their ruling, the High Court will have to look at what the authors of the insurrection clause were hoping to achieve, including whether it was intended only to bar Confederate leaders from taking office after the Civil War. Well, there's a little recent analysis from ABC's Stephen Portnoy on the 1866 debate of the clause that does seem to answer that question. West Virginia Republican Senator Peter Van Winkle told his colleagues at the time that, quote, "This is to go into our Constitution and to stand to govern future insurrection as well as the present. And I should like to have that point definitely understood." Well, more than 155 years later, we'll soon see whether our Constitution and the people who safeguard it are equipped to hold insurrectionists accountable. Do they understand? Joining me now is California Secretary of State Shirley Weber. Welcome to you, Madam Secretary. Happy New Year's Eve. I want to start with the pressure that you received from across the board in your state to remove Donald Trump from the California primary ballot. It wasn't just fellow Democrats amongst the state, your lieutenant governor. What has been the response since your decision not to remove the former president?
Well, overall, we've actually received quite a bit of support not to include him. It's been interesting. There's some articles that in LA Times that interviewed this week, some who have actually been involved in the process as we have in California, because it was not just my decision, because it has to do with much more than that. And so as a result, we've received quite a bit of support that says, no, this is not the thing to do, that maybe the call for it from the lieutenant governor was driven by political pressure in terms of her own elections to be governor. Those kinds of things are factors that factor into some of the decisions that folks had made to call for me to remove them. But by and large, the folks have been supported because I'm generally one who tries as much as possible, despite the fact that I am a Democrat and vote Democrat and I am registered a Democrat, to make sure that the laws of California are followed. Most folks think we have liberal laws. They're not that liberal in terms of elected officials. They're really quite strict in terms of what the secretary can do, how much authority we have to do what people want us to do. And most of our things are driven through the court. And we have had some court cases that have been dismissed that did not allow us to remove him from the ballot.
You know, you told the LA Times, Secretary Weber, that you believe that Donald Trump's behavior was abhorrent and disturbing and an attack on democracy. But do you believe that Donald Trump incited or aided an insurrection on January 6th?
Oh, yes, I believe that. But my belief is not based on law, nor is it based on fact. I mean, other than what I saw and everybody else saw. And it was unfortunate that in all of the discussions that have been held, we have yet to actually hold him accountable for the insurrection that occurred. We held a lot of people accountable, and we've actually basically incarcerated some individuals that have been found guilty of it, quite a few. And yet no one in the Senate or even the Congress has actually brought forth the idea that he was basically the leader of the insurrectionists. In my belief, I think he should have been impeached. And at that time, and of course, we've run against all kinds of deadlines and dates and so forth and so on. But we've avoided, I think, at the federal level, the responsibility of looking at what took place. Anyone who saw the insurrection on January 6th knows that it was an attack on the government. Anyone who doesn't believe Trump had a role in it has not been responsive in terms of looking at the things that need to be there. The issue of the Constitution and whether or not it applies to a state by state or the whole federal discussion has to be addressed because of the fact that you can't have one or two states that are implementing federal law and one or two that are not. And so most of us are hopeful that the Supreme Court will rule in terms of the issue of Colorado. California has a totally different process. We'd have to have a hearing. We'd have to have and we've had some cases to come forward. They've not been strong cases. They've not been strong enough, and they've all been thrown out. So we haven't had a case that really allowed us to really have this conversation and allow our judges to rule on this particular issue and give us instruction as they did in Colorado. And even the hearing that took place in Maine was not done by an individual. It was done through a process. California doesn't have a process.
California does not have a process, and I think it's very important. If we look at what we have on the screen right now, Governor Gavin Newsom, who opposed the efforts to remove Donald Trump from the ballot. What is the law in California is this. The California Constitution, it prohibits anyone who advocates for overthrowing the government from the country from holding elected office, but in California. Now, the question I wonder, okay, do you think then that the state legislature should act to expand that particular provision to ensure that that applies to all candidates and ballots as well, including for national office?
Well, we'd have to ask, and I think that's a discussion that has to be held. I mean, because you say one of the problems we face is that, who's an insurrectionist? Maybe I've heard folks say that Black Lives Matter people should never hold office because they have engaged in some kind of activity, some violent activity, or some discussion of making the government be responsive to their needs. That's the real challenge we face, is finding out what would actually be the standards to be used, who should use those standards, and how should they be applied? Because I've had folks concerned that it would actually open up the floodgates for anyone who's actually been an activist, who's raised issues, who protested against the government, who may have thrown, had some violent activity that occurred, that all of those individuals would be eligible to be taken off of any ballot in any primary or any general election. So it's an important discussion that has to be held. It can be held in California, but the bottom line is that we've got these folks now who've taken this to the Supreme Court, and we have consistently asked them to answer some critical questions. Is Donald Trump immune to prosecution? I mean, that's an extremely important question for a democracy. Does this law apply in terms of insurrection to every election, and what are the standards to be implemented and the process to be used? I mean, this is very, very important. And I think we as a nation have avoided this kind of conversation because of the fact that we haven't had this level of engagement on the part of a former president to try to overthrow the government in terms of their own election. So this is, and I'm optimistic that the Supreme Court on January 4th will actually take this up. We're waiting to see what happens. And without it, we're going to have some states that have him on the ballot and some that don't. And then what will happen is we'll have chaos because people will argue that it was rigged against him again, so forth and so on, and those kinds of things. And so we really need a national discussion and a national decision about this particular amendment in the Constitution.
I have heard many legal scholar make the argument that you just made, Madam Secretary, even folks right here on this network. I do want to just clarify very quickly, because I don't want anyone to misconstrue what you may have said. You do not believe that activists who have participated in the Black Lives Matter movement are insurrectionists?
No, but what I'm concerned about is that those who are on the other side, when you write laws, you can't write them for the person, for me as a Democrat. You have to make sure that it applies to everyone. And no, I don't believe that. But what happens is that many are concerned that folks will use this. They try to use it against Maxine Waters, an issue, I think, in Illinois or something. So we have to make sure that we are clear about it. Some folks believe anybody who has a negative attitude should basically not run for office. Well, I think that would be ridiculous when we look at the folks who have been in office and the protesters, whether it's John Lewis or whomever, that have basically protested against the government with regards to policies and issues. So, no, I don't believe that at all. But I'm saying that that's the danger we run into if we don't get clarity about what we mean when we talk insurrection, if we don't have folks who are willing to actually litigate these matters, and we don't have a statement from our Supreme Court that's clear. What's the process? Who does this? Who makes this decision for the nation? Because it's a federal decision. This is a person who's going to represent the United States. It's not the governor of California or the Secretary of State of California. This is the nation. And the world is watching, I can tell you that, to see exactly whether or not our Supreme Court, which is one of its job, is going to rule on this critical matter, and matter that's probably more important than any other decision that they will have had during their time.
California Secretary of State Shirley Weber, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Simone. I appreciate being with you.